Applejack sat by herself, only accompanied by a bright yellow light from her desk lamp. The rest of the room shrouded in darkness. The world had long since fallen asleep, but her, she hadn't been able to find sleep, although it had indeed been looking for her, if her heavy eyelids were any indication. Any moment now, they drooped down as if lead weights were strung to each of them, and they had slid down once or twice, or thrice, every few seconds, only for her to jolt back from black to colour again. She had been able to work long hours before, often finding herself to be able to take a kip very easily after long working days in the orchards. Like the one time, she had done half an entire harvest by herself. She had pushed her body's limits. Staying awake late at night and fighting off sleep wasn't a normality for her, and her rhythmically gently ticking clock proved she had pulled a new best. It was now only 3 hours from sunrise. 3 a.m. Applejack sighed tidily, and the heftiness of such a heavy breath caused her frame to shudder. Although, that might have been a subtle breeze from the window that blew its way inside, ever so gently, through the slight ajar crack in her raised window, by her bed at the opposite side of the room. Either way, she didn't care to so much as move, let alone take her eyes off the item in front of her. No. She couldn't, even if she tried, and she had tried, but found it impossible. Held loosely by a tired hoof that was slumped and balanced on her desk was a framed photo of her grandmother behind a thin pane of glass. It was the last photo ever taken of her. Granny Smith, the one in question. She was the root of the family. She was the apple tree, if you will. She was where it all began. She may have only been half the full apple, but without her and her husband, Apple Strudel, there would have been no Brightmac. Without Brightmac and his childhood sweetheart, Pear Butter, whom was known lovingly as Buttercup, there wouldn't have been any of the 3 apple siblings. Generation after generation, the apples on the tree grow per branch, and they are farmed to be strong and unwavering. They are brought up with respect, nourishment, and family values. Brightmac and stores of pear butter are survived only by Granny Smith and by other family and friends. At least, that used to be the case. Ask a pony like Applejack. She may be tough, strong, and independent, and admittedly rough around the edges in certain regards that she gets ribbed for on occasion. She can't have a basis for comparison. None of the Apple siblings can. Simply put, neither were around long enough to have memories of them. At the very least, none that Applejack, the middle child, can recall. The oldest, Big Mac, and baby sister, Apple Bloom, can also not testify to that. At the reunions, every single time the family members from around the globe of Equestria's expansive world and their respective branches of Apple family hauled themselves to the farm, the land where it all began, Applejack, Big Mac, and Apple Bloom were the only ones with no mother or father present. No parents. There was no Brightmac to see his son and daughters grow up, and no Pear Butter to record memories through photographs or anecdotal means. Applejack had her responsibilities, much like her siblings during managing and setting up the reunions, but she couldn't stray away from them. However, the young mare had memories plastered all about the place in every direction she looked. When she'd trot around and mingle, she'd always be cheery and give a friendly "Howdy," but she'd never be able to escape the deep down pain that panged her heart and gave her a cramp in her chest. It came and went, usually as strong as a buck to the ribs by a full-size horse with equally large hooves with freshly bolted horseshoes. Except they had elongated, sharpened nails in them. Applejack rarely cried, especially not in public sight, much less in view of her family, but there had been times she'd gotten so overwhelmed by a sadness she couldn't escape from that she had excused herself from the reunion, locked herself in her room or the bathroom upstairs, and cried silently to herself. She would then brush her hair, wash out her face to rid herself of the matted streaks beneath from her tears, and she'd rejoin the reunion once she was presentable yet again. She'd walk right back into idle conversation and be given comments on
how your mother and father would be so proud of you,
or my, how big little Bloom is garden, or Big Mac's just like his pa. And then all the pain rushes back at once, and Applejack once again becomes absent for a while. It's a portion of her life that she can't escape from, and has to find ways and make excuses if it meant tucking it beneath her metaphorical belt and pretending that she's okay. The only window she had into the world of what her mother and father were like was Granny Smith, who Applejack was sure would be some sort of godly or fantastical figure if this were to be written down in one of Twilight's crazy works of fiction. Now, more than anything, Applejack wished that this was a work of fiction. Life was strange without her grandmother around. Her grandfather, she had only met him a few times. Granny never spoke much about him. He was mostly on the road for the majority of his life, as a travelling merchant of sorts, selling baked goods and ingredients freshly grown, right on their own home soil. The photograph of Granny Smith was much like any other photo of her, showing her rocking away in her rocking chair, like she always did, and with silvery white hair atop her head and done up in a bun. Her golden eyes were always so lively, but you can't take time and wisdom out of them, regardless of age, and Granny's eyes were as potent as the colour of whiskey. They stung like it too, when she gives the pony the stink eye, and she quickly puts them back in their place. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind or live her life how she wanted to. As far as she was concerned, she was a free spirit, and she was her own boss. She was at an age not many ponies get to live to, and it entitled her to make the most of it, and she did. In this photo, behind all the gathered wisdom and passion for life she had, soaked up like buttermilk through the years, there resided tiredness and haziness. Granny was an old boiler, as a pony such as Big Mac put it. That earned him a quick scolding from Applejack, but her brother never meant it in a bad way. Granny Smith was a cup of hard cider and 100 proof. She may have been an old boiler, but the old girl wasn't a layabout nor a complainer. She was the biggest apple, is how he continued his summary of his grandmother. He'd later say with a smile, "There may be snow on the roof, but the fire ain't gone out." And that would earn a smile from Applejack too. She may not have felt like it, but she somehow sourced the energy to manage it. Granny's mind had begun to wander in her older years, and her age certainly showed it. It began as your typical forgetfulness and rambling that most old ponies endure. But Granny was older than most of those ponies. A pony would still be lucky to kick the bucket and remember who they are and who their family is, and have all their memories intact. In their grandmother's case, it was a bit more complex than that. This was the mare who had brought each child up like her own since the passing of their mother and eventually their father, her own son. The mere mention of Bright Mac's name on Granny when she was still conscious of that name made her eyes water and her figure droop. She never spoke of him very much, and who could blame her? But you did know she thought of him every single day. Then, it happened. Upon hearing the name of her son being spoken out by none other than Apple Bloom, Her response was a clueless and hazy, "Who?" Applejack never heard that with her own ears, but all she saw of that conversation was a tearful Apple Bloom running out of the house and shoving her red-maned head into her big sister's chest. Poor Granny didn't even know who she was. The marbles may have been rolling in and out between her ears inconsistently, and it seemed they knocked out the conduits within the fuse box, and then knocked them back in place with a hot spark. It wasn't until later that day that Granny remembered who Apple Bloom was, and gave the confused filly a hug like nothing had happened. The forgetfulness became a daily occurrence from then on, in more frequent moments than usual for the Apple Elder. She began to forget what words and sentences she had been saying almost straight after they had left her mouth, whether that was during either a casual conversation or one of her many rambling episodes of youthful endeavours. Somehow, unlike Apple Bloom, Applejack herself had been spared the heartache of knowing the pain of a much-loved elderly or relative or paternal figure forgetting her own name. How that is, she didn't know. But her poor sister, on the other hand, she wasn't going to forget that moment for as long as she lives. With her being the youngest, Applejack silently hoped and prayed to herself that she wouldn't end up like that one day and forget who her baby sister and big brother are. Although it's a terrible thing to say and to think, she slapped herself for it. Applejack would rather die than allow herself to get to that age. Seeing a first-hand example like that, it makes a pony think long, hard and deep. And think Applejack did. While she was usually capable and able to help out her grandmother in any way she might need, especially as her later days really set in, Applejack, along with her siblings, could only do so much for her. The simple tasks of helping her to get around the house was a task that every sibling was used to, from getting up and down the stairs and in and out of bed and getting out of her rocking chair. When it came to running the farm and keeping an even steady flow of work going, enough to support the family and keep them stable on top of meeting a high level of care for their grandmother, that's when it all got complicated. As Applejack sat there, slumped in her seat, the loosely gripped photo of Granny in her now numb hoof, the tears found their way to her eyes again and made them appear like highly polished emeralds. Her eyelids drooped yet again, if but for a moment, and her body slumped further with them as her body very momentarily shut down and then rebooted with a sudden jolt and jerk to her nerves. She went stiff, then limp, and went back to being numb and empty. Once again she sighed heavily and slowly touched the photo of Granny with her upper hoof, and she thought that maybe she could touch her through the paper protected by the thin sheet of glass pane. Alas, she couldn't. A stray tear found its way from her cheek and made a splotching sound on the glass as it impacted. It happened to land directly on Granny's smiling face. How Applejack had wished so much more that she could see that face one more time in real life rather than a photograph. It felt so haunting in its very own way, and the way the photos smiled back at her even through the very last time she saw the real Granny's face, it was anything but. Sadly, it wasn't her who had discovered her that evening. No. That unfortunate discovery was made by Big Mac. It was the 3rd of June at around 6 p.m, and Big Mac had found her in the living room, sitting in her rocking chair, same as always. The mare was sat with her hooves low over her stomach, head tilted slightly downwards, with her lips slightly parted, as if stuck in an endless small snore that never made a sound. Naturally, Mac had assumed she was asleep, until he realised a lack of snores that usually followed her napping sessions. Big Mac had made extra sure of what he was dreading by touching her and reacting as if he had just touched cold water. Of course, she maybe wasn't as cold as that, definitely not moving into ice cube territory. But what exactly are you meant to compare the temperature of a dead body to without being insensitive or inappropriate? It's not as if the Book of Life had a chapter explaining it or giving rules on what you can or can't attribute it to, metaphorically or similarly. The haunted hollow gaze of Big Mac won't soon be forgotten by Applejack. How he came up to her room and opened the door to her, his green eyes dulled and glazed, his face blank and emotionless. It was as if somebody had flipped the power switch to off and then snapped off the lever, permanently locking it in that position. Applejack needn't ask what her brother had come to tell her, for she too ended up in tears shortly after. When she saw her for herself, Applejack didn't know how she should feel. She never saw her parents' bodies when they both passed, so that made this the very first time she has ever been in this situation. Granny Smith was there right in front of her, her vessel an empty shell and laying idle in a position deemed classic of her. All of her fuses were switched off, and the lights were no longer on. Her soul had departed and gone to the roundup. The fire had gone out. Poor Granny, is all Big Mac whispered now and again, barely loud enough for Applejack to notice, but she heard his powerful vocal cords from a bassy rumble as they formed the words. And her? She only stood there. She only stood there, stared, and her ears flopped back over her skull in sadness. She wasn't a stranger to grief, as harsh as it can sound to an outside ear. She had anticipated it wouldn't be long. Granny was already in a bad way, and not much could be done for her anyway. Not by her two siblings, and not by any carers. There was only so much you could do for any pony in that position, and they had all done what they could at their disposal. Any of them would have done so without question. Of all the ways she could have gone out, this scenario was the most preferable, and the best most can hope for when their time comes. Granny Smith's number had been punched out, and it was time to collect. The one thing neither Applejack or Big Mac would forget anytime soon would be how their little sister reacted to the news. Oh, Celestia, that poor little filly. Their baby sister. She was destroyed by the news. She practically burst into tears faster than an overpressurized water mains. The only other heartbreaking thing in the room besides Granny was the sound and sight of Apple Bloom wailing with her tears streaming down her face. Neither of them really wanted her to see her grandmother like that, and it was with great reluctance they allowed her in to see her after much protest. They didn't want her last memory of Granny to be that one, and give her emotionally wounding mental scarring. Alas, some things you simply can't help take place. They'll do so, with or without your consent. You only better hope it's never anything to do with grievance, despite its inevitability, and every living creature is mortal and biding their time. It truly makes your mind wander into dark territory and puts things into perspective. Applejack slid down slightly in her seat, as yet a third sigh left her lips. Her ear had become numb from the position she was sitting in, and her body clock told her to get into bed on the double before her brain could have the chance to power down and enter rest mode. She knew she hardly had the power to move, let alone make the journey to her bed, but it was only a few paces behind her. The physical fatigue had transformed her legs into limp, wet noodles. Turning to face the photo yet again, Applejack's eyes met Granny's. Even on paper, They were lively. It was as if her energy and life force itself had manifested into that photo, as if that moment was still very much alive and she was staring right at her in the same way as when the photo was taken. As it happens, by her. Now that the poor mare was gone, the three siblings were left with a massive hole in their hearts, and a tear in the fabric that was the family. No, not a mere fabric. It was more like a tapestry. That would be more befitting. The Apple family tapestry, with a rich and colourful history behind it, with every single stitch lovingly holding it together. Granny's place was so significant. Rather than her loss throwing a stitch, it was more like an entire chunk had been bitten off. It may now be missing, but the legacy of it remains in the family legend. That is a status not held in place via stitches and involving textiles, but rather family love and grace. The surviving memories and stories that came with an impressive lifestyle. It would be fair to say that Granny was the oldest living pony in Ponyville. She had certainly earned more than that bragging right before the town was even properly dubbed, filed and founded. The very first draft of what would become their family's main land of orchards, rural landscapes and farmhouse was built with humble roots. A small shack becoming a cabin, then a cabin becoming a roost, then a roost becoming a humble abode, and then that humble abode becoming a livelihood that stands in the present day site of the fair structure. Que Sera, Sera. Applejack began to mumble. She was far too tired to muster up the power to form a strong voice as usual, her throat long becoming too overcome by sleep to fully warm up. Whatever will be, she said, eyes locked into Granny's paper-printed gaze. The future's not ours to see. A second voice, confirmed to be Big Mac's as Applejack found once she lazily turned her head to see, also evidently too tired to fall asleep, joined in. He was no better off than she was. Que Sera, Sera. What will be, will be. A third voice. Apple Blooms joined the duet and made it a trio. Her face drained of energy and clearly as tired as the both of them. But it was apparent her mind was unable to stay away from her siblings' exact same thoughts. Applejack smiled as she saw her join in, for once not telling her to go back to bed. Given the circumstances, she both wasn't in a position to tell her to go back to her bed, nor to tell her she couldn't grieve in her own way. Que Sera, Sera. Applejack finished the verse and watched as her little sister approached her. Applejack picked up her sibling and sat her on her lap, both of them now staring at Granny's photo. Big Mac joined them both and did the same, and the three of them felt a fourth presence without the coloured ink. Now I have children of my own. Applejack lightly and lovingly stroked Apple Bloom's mane as she sang the next verse. They asked their mother, what will I be? Will I be handsome? Big Mac joined in. Will I be rich? I tell them tenderly. Que Sera, Sera. Whatever will be, will be. Apple Bloom sang herself, leaning into her big sister, while her hoof continued to stroke her ruffled red mane. The future's not ours to see. Que Sera, Sera. Applejack sang. What will be, will be. Big Mac sang. Que Sera, Sera. Apple Bloom finished. Before the three siblings knew it, they had all fallen asleep together in each other's embrace, huddled around Applejack's desk. Apple Bloom was in her big sister's lap, still hugging her barrel, while Big Mac was curled up by his second older sister. In Applejack's hoof, the framed photo of Granny Smith was still being held, Granny's facing the 3 sleeping siblings. If one would look closely enough, they'd see the sweet smile on the old mare curl up into a larger smile, while the golden eyes became more tearful. They may also assume they've lost their minds when the mouth formed the words, Que Sera, Sera.